Welcome to Westmoreland Community Connections, a look at issues and happenings on Classic Hits 107.1 WHJB. Here now is your host, Jennifer Miele, Chief Communications Officer and Managing Director of Evangelization of the Diocese of Greensburg.
Welcome to Westmoreland Community Connections on WHJB. I'm your host, Jennifer Miele. I'm not sure if many of you are aware, but January is actually Human Trafficking Month, and it's an opportunity for all of us to become more aware of this major crisis throughout our community and throughout our world. And here to talk about that today with me is Shelby. She is the outreach advocate and a counselor for the Blackburn Center. Also joining me today is Jason Slonceski. He's a member of the Human Trafficking Task Force with the Blackburn Center. He's actually employed by the Children's Bureau. So thankful to have you both here this morning. Thank you, Shelby. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you for having us.
Shelby, thanks for reaching out to WHJB and Westmoreland Community Connections to talk about this important topic. So tell us about it. What don't people know about what's happening?
So I think a lot of people aren't aware of the depth of human trafficking. We hear a lot of misinformation or stereotypical information on social media, even sometimes in places such as the news. So the Westmoreland Human Trafficking Task Force, as well as the Blackburn Center, and our community partners really work to provide that education and awareness around this growing industry. Human trafficking, in fact, is one of the largest growing industries worldwide, accounting for about 150 billion US dollars every single year. Now, human trafficking actually involves a little bit more than what I believe most people realize it does. So it includes the act of recruiting, harboring, soliciting, patronizing, transporting, or soliciting. I might have said soliciting already, but soliciting someone through the means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of commercialized sex or labor. I think sometimes we get a little hung up on this commercialized sex, but it also includes labor trafficking as well.
And so this is not just an international problem happening overseas or below the border. This is happening in the United States.
Absolutely. And I believe my partner here, my partner in crime here for today, Jason, I shouldn't say crime. That probably isn't my best language. But his work, especially with the Children's Bureau as well, he gets to work with a lot of folks who are potentially experiencing trafficking as well.
Yes,
right here with me.
Partner in fighting crime. So I think you are going down the right.
Partner in fighting crime.
Sure.
I like that, Jennifer.
Jason, tell us about your job and what you're seeing.
Sure. So I'm the assistant director at the Westmoreland County Children's Bureau. And as far as the Children's Bureau's perspective goes, Pennsylvania updated the Child Protective Service Law just a few years ago to include trafficking as a something we can investigate as far as child abuse goes. Because what we investigate is different than what the police investigate. We're investigating, children who are abused by essentially their parents, their caregivers, people whom they ought to be able to trust. Typically we don't investigate those situations where, it's a stranger that the child doesn't know that hurt the child or abused. But that kind of changed a couple of years ago when they incorporated sex trafficking into the Child Protective Service Law. So it is something that we started investigating after that occurred. We've had a couple cases in Westmoreland County. One interesting thing, and I think Shelby had touched on a little bit, is some of those misperceptions about what sex trafficking is. One of the things that when we talk to people about it, they think that sex trafficking involves, kidnapping of children, taking children off the street and forcing them into trafficking. And while that may happen, That's not typically what we're seeing in Westmoreland County. Westmoreland County, we're not an urban population. We're mostly suburban, rural population. So some of what we're seeing in our county is a little bit different. I think one of the things often we see is the traffickers are people that know the kids. The traffickers are people whom the children had developed a relationship with. Many times it's somebody whom they met online. They develop trust with. And that trust, gets perverted, and the trafficker kind of turns that trust around back on the child. Trafficking can take forms of, the parents, where we've had cases where parents are, abusing substances and to fuel their own addiction. They might be trafficking, prostituting themselves, but then they may also be trafficking their children as well. We've had a couple of cases like that as well. So it's not typically what we see as far as those kidnapping the kids, out of Target, kidnapping those kids as they're walking home from school. Certainly that happens, but the vast majority of the cases, at least that we're seeing at the Children's Bureau, is those kind of cases where the trafficker knows the child and had manipulated that child being a victim of trafficking.
Jason, this is just, I have the chills. I know you guys do this every day, but when you hear this, it's just shocking. And I guess my question is how are these cases usually cracked? If a parent is trafficking a child to feed their substance abuse, how does it finally come to a head?
On one specific case, I know where it came to a head on that specific issue is one of the men that was going to the mom for her services. Mom had talked about that, and he was not okay with that. He's actually the one that had reported that. So other times it's, family members or teachers that, they hear something, friends of the children who know a little bit about what's going on and they're concerned, for their friend, as far as what their friend's been up to, what their friend's been doing. They can report it. They can report it anonymously too, which is always really important. And it's really people around the child that are knowledgeable about, the child and what the child's going through and sees changes in behavior and red flags that, that they're concerned about.
And Shelby, I would imagine that's part of your job is to teach people, here are some things to look at, behavioral changes, physical changes. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. And to go off of that, whenever we also work with adults here at the Blackburn Center. So with adults, a lot of times what we're seeing are those different access points of help, such as going into the hospitals. So all of our nurses here in Westmoreland County, whether that they work at Frick, Latrobe, or Westmoreland Hospital, they each receive education and ongoing education on different issues such as domestic violence, because sometimes human trafficking can look like domestic or sexual violence, as well as human trafficking, so that they understand what this looks like, how they can identify it, and then how they can access support through an advocate at the Blackburn Center. So at Blackburn Center, we're able to provide services to potential survivors of human trafficking, whether it be through counseling and therapy, legal advocacy accompaniment, medical advocacy, where we'll go out to the hospitals 24/7 to navigate survivors through that process. Or if some, as well as, like you said, education. So we start our education programs as early as the middle school age, although we're also providing education around consent, empathy, and dating violence at the younger ages as well. But how do we identify human trafficking? So like I said, with our adults, we actually had a case of sex trafficking where the neighbors noticed that the women it was a place of business and that they were doing their laundry outside of this place of business. So they keyed into that and felt this isn't right, and called in and said, there's something going on with this. So what we try to do is we provide this education so people can identify when human trafficking is potentially coming about. So perhaps they notice that someone hasn't received care for a long time. They've delayed care. They're going to a hospital setting. They have cuts that are infected that should have been being taken care of, or other medical needs that should have been taken care of. Perhaps this person is not well dressed for the weather. We're going into these colder months right now. In fact, there was one survivor who stated, I went into a McDonald's and I was a teenager and I was dressed completely inappropriately, yet no one batted an eye at me. So looking at, is this person appropriately dressed for the weather? Even are they appropriately dressed, for the age range that they're in? Are they being accompanied by someone such as an adult or an interpreter or something along those lines, where this person isn't allowing them to speak for themselves? However, I should also caution this with, a lot of times our survivors, they're not right next to the person that's trafficking them. People that traffic, they use a grooming process where they isolate them, they fill a need, they exploit vulnerabilities, and they use this process in order to gain power and control over our victim, so that our victim doesn't have to be in quite literally chains. We see that imagery a lot with human trafficking. Someone is in physical chains, chained into their basement, something along those lines. But oftentimes our survivors are out in the community, and our person that's trafficking them may use something such as a cell phone. I just was listening to one person a survivor who was saying the person that was trafficking them would have them log in on Facebook, which had that geolocator, so that he would know where that they were, if they were with a potential John, or they may have them have their phone on, so they're calling them, or maybe if they have a smartwatch, that's on so the trafficker can hear what's going on. Or so maybe they're not with them, but when you ask them a question, the response sounds very scripted. So just identifying those different aspects that might not seem right allows us to identify these potential indicators that we educate our community around.
It sounds like almost a psychological imprisonment, as well as, some kind of physical limitations that are placed on these people. It's very psychological, where you're, befriending these people, gaining the trust, building a relationship, isolating, very targeted to do that. I'm sure you see that, Jason, with the children.
Right. So what a typical case may look like is, a child, meets somebody on social media, to build a relationship with the person. The person, the child is confiding in the person, sharing, their, deep emotional, feelings about whatever, because teenagers, have feelings and they discuss those. And then once the child starts sharing that personal information, the trafficker then has power over that child. If that trafficker, if starts getting flirty with that child, and that child starts sharing, risque photos of themselves online, with somebody that they don't know, that trafficker has more power over that child. And the trafficker can kind of then start to use that information and extort that child to get more, essentially maybe saying, if you don't do X, I'm going to share this photo I have of you with everybody on your, Instagram list, or everyone on your Facebook, your friend list. I'm going to send it to your mom. I'm going to send it to your grandmother. I'm going to send it to your dad. So you have, teenagers that are already potentially emotionally vulnerable, then having this threat over them and this power over them. And they may do, push a little further. They may do X and hope that, that's all it needs to be. Trafficker has more power and they keep pushing it. and pushing it. And then all of a sudden, this child is in so deep, that they don't know how to get out, and then the trafficker has all this power. And that's where the scary part is. It's a lot of times it's somebody whom that child thought they could trust, and they may not have known, who that person is at all. Other situations we see, may start with a boyfriend situation, where, somebody thought they were dating someone, the boyfriend, may say, hey, I'm struggling, I can't, pay my rent, I can't, I can't, make my bills, hey, if you can help me out, if you really love me, this guy offered me, $50, if you can, go and just like fool around with him a little bit, offer me $50. If you really love me, you can do that. And, a victim may do that, kind of once that happens, that's where that's where that more of that power starts, is like, hey, well, you did that. Well, what about this? Keep kind of pushing that. And again, before you know it, a child is in too deep. They don't know how they got there, because they thought it was with somebody they love. They thought it was with somebody who cares about them, and they don't know how to get out. And it's a scary situation.
Jason Slonceski is a member of the Human Trafficking Task Force. He works for the Children's Bureau of Westmoreland County. He's also joined today by Shelby. She's an outreach advocate and counselor with the Blackburn Center. We're talking about Human Trafficking Month this January and building awareness around human trafficking. You're listening to Westmoreland Community Connections on WHJB. I'm your host, Jennifer Miele. We'll be right back.
This is Westmoreland Community Connections on Classic Hits 107.1 WHJB. If you have a suggestion for a topic, or if your nonprofit organization would like to be featured on this program, call us during regular business hours at 724-216-1200.
Welcome back to Westmoreland Community Connections on WHJB. I'm your host, Jennifer Miele, talking today with two experts during Human Trafficking Month of January. Shelby, an outreach advocate and counselor with the Blackburn Center, and Jason Slonceski. He's a member of the Human Trafficking Task Force and works at the Children's Bureau of Westmoreland County. I am enthralled by what you're telling me. Eyes are open, wide open today on Westmoreland Community Connections about human trafficking, the vulnerabilities, the education surrounding it, identifying it, preventing it. I have to ask you both how you got into this line of work. So I'm going to start with you, Shelby. Tell us about your background.
So part of my background is I actually studied psychology at Clarion University and started by interning with our local rape crisis center, Passages. And I truly fell in love with the work that they had done at that agency. And I got very lucky. I was studying to be a volunteer here at Blackburn Center when a new program was coming about called the Underserved Populations Program. And the Underserved Populations Program here at Blackburn Center started about 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago, actually now. And it focused on different crimes and populations that often fell through the cracks, including victims with disabilities, crimes such as elder abuse, and human trafficking. So with that, our program quite literally just built itself up around all the work that Blackburn Center was already doing on gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and other types of crimes that Blackburn Center works with as well. To create education, do advocacy work. So I was very lucky with the opportunity to work within our criminal justice systems as an advocate for survivors. And then as well as then recently in the past year, I was brought in as our outreach specialist, which is my brand new title that is being just brought about this month. And to get the opportunity to work with the Westmoreland Human Trafficking Task Force, that our program, the Underserved Populations Program, worked to develop with our community partners in the area as we were identifying just the need in our community to provide education and advocacy work. for our county.
Amazing background, and the county is most certainly blessed to have you. Jason, let's hear about you.
Sure. I graduated from St. Vincent College in 2002 with a degree in psychology. I really liked the idea of investigating and helping people. That's kind of what I wanted to do coming out of college. In 2007, I was blessed to start with the Westmoreland County Children's Bureau. Started as a caseworker, so I was doing investigations into child abuse and neglect. I started my current position as assistant director in 2015. In relation to sex trafficking, as I mentioned earlier, sex trafficking really wasn't something that Children's Bureau or CYS agencies could really investigate, previously until a law was passed, and that was the Preventing Sex Trafficking and Strengthening Families Act. It was signed passed in 2014. So that really put it on the radar for children and youth agencies, where federal law said that if a child is a runaway, we have to do screening for that child to verify that child, wasn't a risk or wasn't a victim of sex trafficking or any kind of trafficking. Sorry. So the state had developed a screening tool for that and mandated that, it's something we have to do. It's important. It's happening. That really put her on the radar, that federal legislation for CYS agencies, that there's more that we could be doing. It really made training for this important, for children and youth workers. It was about the same time that really nationally it was the issue was gaining a lot of attention. So Pennsylvania, had passed similar state law enacting that federal legislation. And we've been kind of working at it at the Children's Bureau to educate the community as far as what is sex trafficking, what does it look like in Westmoreland County, and what can we do to prevent it. So I've been kind of working on implementing the federal law and the state law in my agency to make sure everyone here is well trained in what sex trafficking is. Breaking through some of those misconceptions that people have, and making sure that we can, try to keep the children in Westmoreland County as safe as possible.
I'm glad to hear a fellow Bearcat is in charge of all this. So wonderful. Great background on both of you. Shelby, let's talk for a minute about the labor trafficking. Can you explain what that is? Maybe give an example of one that you've heard over the years.
So labor trafficking is where we see someone, as we said before, recruiting, soliciting, harboring, transporting someone through the means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of labor. So Polaris actually identified about 25 legal industries, oftentimes, where we see labor trafficking occur underneath. So we can see labor trafficking maybe in farming. So where people often need cheaper labor, people are being oftentimes exploited. So we might see someone such as just a local farmer who says, I have to meet all of this needs. But I need cheaper labor. So I'm going to hire someone. And then this specific person brings in a crew. Our person that is in charge of this business pays this point person, and then he is supposed to distribute the money to everyone else. However, this specific point person can act very much as if we're kind of in the same framework with sex trafficking. We have a pimp, right? So this person acts as the employer, but he is now in charge of distributing the money. Oftentimes what we see with labor trafficking is that people are promising this grand opportunity for people. They're promising the American dream, that they're going to be able to afford a home, the white picket fence, the whole 9 yards. They get money to send back to their family so that they can, just meet their needs. However, what we often find is that this becomes indentured servitude, where someone not only now has to pay, maybe gets gets that little bit of money that perhaps that they're supposed to get, but now they also have to pay back this employer for transportation to get to that job. Any tools, anything that the employer says that they needs paid, housing. If this person is from another country and they came over, they have to pay those transportation fees to get them over, or any just hiring fees. So that this big potential money that was promised to them slowly dwindles down to nothing, to the point that it's not even a livable wage. We can see this in other industries as well, such as hospitality management. So we may see people such as maids, who are oftentimes survivors as well of labor trafficking. We could see this in industries such as forestry. We could even see it at places like carnivals that we frequent. So oftentimes these are just things that are they're in plain sight, but they're done underneath the cover of a legal industry.
So Shelby, what is your advice as we wrap up the show? We have about 2 minutes left here. What would you want people to do if they recognize this, if they see something? Who do they call? Where do they go? How do they report it?
So, there's a couple of different ways of reporting trafficking. In our county, people are more than welcome to call the Blackburn Center hotline for support and help. Our hotline number here is 888-832-2272. People can also call the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which they can look up online if they type up National Human Trafficking Hotline. But also, if they suspect that a child is involved, they can reach out to Childline, especially if they're a mandated reporter.
And that's where you come in, Jason. That Childline number is called, and then you're called.
Right. Childline is 1-800-932-0313. And anyone can call Childline to report any concerns of abuse or neglect. I always tell people, if you're not sure, call anyways. There's no harm that comes from calling and reporting it. Worst case or best case, nothing's happening. Worst case, something's happening, and you helped the child. So
that's anonymous as well, too, right? I mean, so it's not like you're putting your life on the line here by telling something.
Right. Anyone can call Childline and remain anonymous. Childline certainly respects that. If they don't provide us any information if somebody wishes to remain anonymous. I will say it's helpful whenever we have people that don't want to remain anonymous, because sometimes there is some follow-up information we want to reach back out to the referral source on to just verify some information. Perhaps an address wasn't quite right. Perhaps we need to get a little bit more information. So it is helpful when we can contact back the referral source to gather more information. But certainly that's not necessary. Certainly people can call anonymously, and that's certainly respected as well.
I can't thank you both enough for talking with me today about human trafficking. This is Awareness Month here in January. Shelby, outreach advocate and counselor from the Blackburn Center, and Jason Slonceski, he's the assistant director of the Westmoreland County Children's Bureau. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're listening to Westmoreland Community Connections on WHJB.
This has been Westmoreland Community Connections, a look at issues and happenings in and around Westmoreland County. Join us again next week on Classic Hits 107.1 WHJB.